So in this presentation, Jussi and I will briefly talk about how we leveraged a threat model that was developed in the OpenSSF end users working group some time ago. We leveraged that internally at Ericsson to validate some of our controls and talk a bit about the lessons that we learned. Who are we? Well, who are you?
I'm Jussi Auvinen, so that's how you pronounce it, around something like that. Other pronunciations probably okay. So I've been working with software security for around 10 years, not by choice, but for other reasons. But doing software development since like 95 or so, and in different capacities, obviously, developer and so forth. At the time of doing this research and this study for Ericsson, I was an architect for Ericsson Security Reliability Model. So this model is the model how Ericsson does secure software development. So that's how we define. These are the things, this static analysis you need to do, this is whatever assurance, these are functional requirements and so forth. So I was an architect on that, I'm driving that sort of things, and kind of especially there I was a driver for secure coding. So I've been hearing some of these pointers on secure coding, like static code analysis. Would like to learn and hear more, but it's not about that, I guess, today. So, Georg.
Yes.
Who are you really?
I'm Georg. I'm a member of the OSPO at Ericsson, around in open source for some time, and involved in a few OpenSSF initiatives, as you may be aware already. So I'll keep it short. Good. So, at some day, beginning of last year, Jussi came to me and said he was interested in running a study to investigate and validate and verify the security controls that we have in place as part of the security policies, basically, that apply to open source software or use of open source software at Ericsson. And of course, that's a very valid thing to do. But as part of that larger investigation, obviously, a couple of key questions come up. Like, first, of course, which controls should really be in place, right? Then, of course, this is more internally focused, which controls are in place, have they been implemented, and so on. But are there also new aspects, new threat vectors, basically, that need to be considered now that may have not been considered in previous iterations of these studies? So, obviously, those are the key questions. There are more. But how do you find answers to those questions? And we basically, in the little study team, agreed to use threat modeling as the underlying methodology and use that threat model to kind of do a risk assessment of the threads, obviously, and then the output of that risk assessment to prioritize which controls we need to look at internally the most importantly, pressingly, to get those sorted out. So it's basically, because there are plenty of attack vectors, obviously, but which controls are basically high up on the list of, or with a high priority. We looked at various threat models, and within the OpenSSF, there are also different threat models around. Like SALSA has one, but back in the days, beginning of 2024, the OpenSSF end users working group was working on one. So I pointed Jussi at that, and after a quick, let's say, assessment, we thought, okay, that's a good basis to really kind of a good foundation for the work we wanted to do. And we started using that. And of course, any improvements that came out of our work should also go back into the model. One such contributions, for instance, is that we mapped ISO 27K controls that we also use as part of the security policy back to the threads identified in the model. But we'd like to get feedback on that too, but that's a statement for later on. So what does the model look like? Quick overview, it basically comprises a high-level data flow diagram that roughly models on a fairly high level the trust boundaries and data flows, obviously between like different trust domains, and it includes 35 individual threads that are classified in 6 categories, roughly inspired, of course, by the data flow diagram. Examples are like threats targeting the employee's machine, build environments, end users environment, the consumption pipeline, these sorts of things. Per thread, obviously the model includes a description, what is the thread about, the potential, an assessment of the potential impact, mitigating controls, and a few examples and references, and that's really useful. Good, so that's basically what we used as input, or to start with. As I said, that model was developed as part of the end users working group, I think throughout 2023-24, and we started beginning of 24. Unfortunately, while we were working on this, the end users working group became dormant. The model, I think, is in a relatively good state. Again, we used it, and we contributed back to it, but due to the end users working group becoming dormant, there was like no further collaboration. Unfortunately, maybe others are now kind of thinking, oh, maybe that's something we should take a look at. But yeah, so that's basically the history and the state. And now I'd like to hand it over to Jussi to talk in more detail about what we did.
Thank you. Before we actually go to this slide, we can have the slide. Please don't read anything. Okay. We had actually one more topic there in the previous slides that we took off because we thought that we don't have time. We are in a hurry, right? Yeah. So there was a statement saying that, okay, this was not the first time, obviously, Ericsson is looking into the security of open source, right? It's not, we have quite a few different kind of studies and things done. And so why are we doing this study now, starting with the threat model? And maybe I can give you some analogy here. So think about a guy like me coming here to give a presentation. I have 2 possible ways to do that. So this is outside of what we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay, this is new for you as well. So the first one is that usually is done. I think about the topic, I made slides, I think about what the people wants to hear, anticipate a little bit of the questions, then I do the presentation and leave a little bit time for Q&A. This sounds reasonable. Another way to do it would be that I come here and say that, okay, threat modeling force questions. So what questions would you have for me for the threat modeling? And then I get some weird questions, well, good one from you, obviously, and try to answer those. So this is actually how many times this happens when you are trying to protect against threats, is that you get incidents. So you act on incidents, so they are not going. You are not going to prepare. You have something happening, you do something really quickly. You have to do something. Or you have a bunch of people who knows a lot of problems. Then you write documents having hundreds of pages of problems. So what is the outcome of that? Okay, you have a nice document. Maybe somebody even approves it at some point in time. What we want to do here is go with the threat modeling. So understand what are the threats when using open source. And the next question, so what kind of risk does that make or give Ericsson, in order to then select what are the important things to do. And now I can start my part.
Yeah,
thank you. Okay, so what we did what with the threat model, first thing is to add threats based on company-owned context. So obviously, I mean, you have a threat model that is generic. It can be augmented, and it probably should for any enterprise taking this model into account. First thing, you have a data flow diagram there. And that data flow diagram probably is not accurate on any real enterprise. So you should actually update and look into that. So how are you actually working differently? Then you have recent incidents, so you know what has happened most probably. Sometimes that's a problem as well because it's security, so it's so secret that nobody tells you, even though you're trying to figure out what to do next. But we had some recent incidents we looked into to have a kind of understanding also that if the threat model actually does address the incidents what we see. So this is what we did. And then the next step, we extend that threat-related information with company-specific data what comes to the risk, actually. So the risk rating is what we wanted to see and have. So what is the risk rating for each of these threats? In order to someone to actually look into this later on and evaluate it, we need to have risk reasoning. So why are we saying that this is the level of risk? Then we need to look in the existing controls, because obviously they mitigate risk already. And then you should propose additional controls. So we added this kind of information for every threat there is. Yes, the button. So we use this kind of a fancy matrix there. We have a little bit more kind of meat on the bone, how you say that probabilities, for example, it's very likely or unlikely or so, but we didn't want to put it in here. But anyway, when you look at the risk from a company point of view, these are the two things that you have to kind of figure out: the impact if that threat happens, and what is the probability that that threat actually does happen. And these controls that we already kind of talked about, they do have an effect on this. What you already have in place, and obviously the idea is that you then devise what are the controls you need to have in place in order the risk level to be on your risk appetite level. So let's go to the outcome of the analysis. We did analyze all the threats. All the risks were evaluated based on this on the threat and existing security controls. And obviously we had quite cunning people there and knowledgeable on many things. So we have experts to do this. And then we found out only 3 of these threats relate to high risk. And that was actually pretty good in a sense, because this is what we wanted to have. What is the most important things, most important areas where we need to improve? And these are the 3 areas that we found out that we need to have more controls. That's a kind of priority thing. So this is compromise a legitimate upstream project. That's a hard word, at least for me. I don't know. It's, okay. Secret exposed to malicious build and mirror malicious component. So for all of these high risks, we also looked into the mitigation controls that were already proposed by the base document, and then what was Ericsson additions there, and also this ISO 27000 controls. So there we got this kind of set of things, set of controls that we proposed from the study to be implemented in our systems. Looking at the future, maybe the first step would be to implement these things, right? So you do studies, and it would be nice to put that in practice. Second thing is to design a data flow diagram that would be kind of accurate, fairly accurate, and for Ericsson, for our use case. We did not have time for that as much as we would have hoped. Then introduce continual threat modeling. So not only do it once, then you're happy, let's see what happens. But we said, for example, semi-annually, you would revisit the threat model and see what is actually happening. And maybe meanwhile, you can look at the incidents and do that sort of things. And then to introduce threat models for other external software, so commercial software. So we should have all this supply chain software coming into Ericsson to have a threat model, so we know what kind of controls they need to be. And obviously for commercial software, even the DFDs, the data flow diagrams, would be quite different, most probably, than for open source. So that would be the future work for us. We are already at summary. That's very fast. Yeah, we are fast. Yeah. So we validated, contributed to, and utilized the threat model. So we found it really, really good. The kind of biggest addition there was actually the mapping to ISO 27000, because that's what, at least for us, is that we are certified against that standard. So one could assume at least that you have these controls in place, and that obviously has impact on the risk levels. We used the model for internal risk assessment, and it was kind of successful, fairly easy to do. There was a lot of work, obviously, but there's a lot of information in this model as well. And then we were able to identify the threats that relates to high risk, and we were able to propose these security controls. Maybe you want to take the last bullet there.
Yeah, right. So I think I didn't mention. Okay, interesting. Right. So the model turned out to be very valuable for us, at least as input. Right. I think I didn't mention that initially, but we picked it because the model specifically, as it was designed in the context of the end users working group, already had like an enterprise use case in mind. And by the way, big shout out and thanks to Henrik from Labs, who kind of drove the development of that model back in the days. We're just using it, right? So obvious. That became obvious, I think. As I said, we contributed back or added back the controls into the document that is obviously still out there in the cloud. Due to, unfortunately, the end users working group becoming dormant, there was no follow-on discussion whether or not this mapping makes sense or not. So that is still very much like feedback that we would be happy to receive. Yeah, take a look at that model if it's useful for you, if you haven't done that yet. Right, yeah. It would be nice if the end users working group would, again, of course, be around. Yep. But I can't promise to spin it up again, so I'm not going to do that. Just saying, if you would be interested in that.
Good. Now we have spent like 15 minutes here already, so maybe it's time for the last slide.
Any questions? Oh, what? Yes. Two.
One of the things we did in the security assessments in CNCF is we go back and look at like how useful they were to the project and what kind of things were found in the threat model. Have you found a lot of vulnerabilities and issues and problems you've been able to tie back to real world remediations that have helped?
You want to take that?
Didn't get the question, so. I didn't get the question, so if you did get that, answer.
Yeah, I need to repeat the question anyway. To paraphrase, did we use this work? Like, did we apply to real world scenarios or incidents?
So when you come and you give guidance based on things,
Yeah.
you have a threat model, and you say, oh,
Yes.
this part of my system is a big risk. Then you often make changes and improvements to try to fix security, or you may audit that part and realize how bad your attack surface is. What I'm asking is, do you do any of that kind of validation to see? Because if you just created a threat model and the outcome was only the threat model,
Mm-hmm.
and you never looked at whether that helped anything or not, then it's not clear if it's a good threat model.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Right. So, in a nutshell, the question is, did we just create the threat model for the purpose of having the threat model, or did we also validate that it helped us to, mitigate real-world threats? I think that
I would say that was exactly what we were trying to do. I mean, you have a threat model where you had like 35 different threats there. So what would you do actually? What are the real threats for your own company that you want to mitigate against? So that is what we did with the risk assessment. So looking at the threat model itself, but understanding what kind of controls we have actually in-house already in place. So we obviously didn't look directly on if there's actual vulnerabilities in the ways that we consume force or other deploy it. Not like that, but we did have kind of insight on that. So people working with that, so the kind of experts in that sense. So maybe that helps. I don't know. But I think the security controls, what we came out with, probably is fairly easy to see that where they actually fit in our infrastructure. So in that sense, it has this kind of tangible, actionable things.
Two questions. Why did you
Please.
Yeah, with the 27,000, so that is that we have certificate on. So that means that we are compliant on that. That means that from our point of view, we can expect that those controls are implemented already. And what we think is, at least I think, is that this is kind of common in enterprises, or bigger enterprises, that they are claiming compliance to 27,002 controls basically, and that's why it is kind of a, because you do have the list of controls there in OpenSSF document. So if you say that these are directly from that standard, it might be easier for people to say, okay, we have that standard, so we can think we probably have that. And the other one was. I mean, this model is actually made for enterprise, not for open source projects. So it's how enterprise actually uses open source.
Yeah, there's probably better or other models out there. I wouldn't really go out and say, if you're a maintainer of a project, use that model. You can, of course, right? There's some threads in there like, okay, the repository credentials have been, compromised. Obviously, that kind of applies, but the key purpose is like, what are the threads in an enterprise open source software usage scenario?
Yep. All right. Thank you. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, computer.